On the front steps of St. Agnes Orphanage, Emma stood alone in the bitter November cold, her entire life reduced to a single canvas bag and a rusted key. At 18, she had finally aged out, but the freedom felt hollow. Mrs. Hartwell, the director, had handed her the key with a look of pity, its faded tag reading, "John Deere, 4020. No letter, no photograph, no explanation. For 18 years, Emma had waited for answers about who left her on those orphanage steps as an infant. Now they told her the only thing her past had left behind was a key to an old tractor, sitting abandoned on some forgotten farm. But why would anyone leave a newborn baby and farming equipment? What could a rusted piece of machinery possibly tell her about where she came from? And what truth was waiting in the one inheritance nobody thought was worth mentioning? The hallway of St. Agnes Orphanage had never felt as cold as it did on Emma's 18th birthday, the pale November light filtering through the tall institutional windows, casting long shadows on the scuffed linoleum floor that had witnessed 18 years of her footsteps. She stood clutching a single worn canvas bag that contained everything she owned in the world, her slender frame dressed in donated jeans and a second-hand coat that smelled faintly of mothballs, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that revealed a face marked by quiet resilience and eyes that held both sadness and determination. Mrs. Hartwell, the orphanage director, sat behind her heavy oak desk, her expression a carefully maintained mask of professional detachment that Emma had learned long ago meant bad news delivered with bureaucratic efficiency. The woman pushed a small manila envelope across the desk's polished surface, the gesture final and dismissive. "This is everything we have for you," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice carrying the tone of someone eager to close a file and move on to the next case, the next child, the next problem that required her minimal attention. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, her heart hammering with a desperate hope that had sustained her through countless lonely nights. The hope that somewhere in these papers she would find a name, a face, a reason why she had been left on these cold steps as an infant wrapped in a thin blanket on a winter morning 18 years ago. But the envelope contained no photographs, no letters written in a mother's hand explaining impossible choices, no family tree revealing her place in the world. Instead, a single rusted key tumbled onto the desk, attached to a faded cloth tag bearing the words "John Deere, 4020, in letters so worn they were barely legible. Mrs. Hartwell cleared her throat, consulting a thin file with obvious impatience. "The key belongs to a tractor," she explained in the same flat tone she might use to discuss cafeteria schedules. "It's located on a property in rural Montana, near a town called Darby in the Bitterroot Valley. According to our records, the property is deeded in your name, but it's been tied up in legal complications for the entire 18 years you've been with us. Some dispute over the original owner's estate. The county finally cleared the title last month, which is why we're able to give this to you now. That's all the information we have." Emma stared at the key, its metal surface pitted with rust and age, its weight in her palm, both substantial and utterly inadequate. This was her inheritance, her only tangible connection to the people who had given her life, and then vanished, leaving behind not love or explanation, but farming equipment on forgotten land. A tractor. The absurdity of it warred with a desperate need to find meaning in this strange bequest. Why would someone leave a baby and a tractor? What could a piece of rusted machinery possibly tell her about where she came from, who she was meant to be? Mrs. Hartwell was already standing, her body language making it clear the meeting was over, that Emma's time as a ward of St. Agnes had reached its bureaucratic conclusion. Emma closed her fingers around the key, feeling its rough edges bite into her palm, and walked out of the orphanage into a world that felt impossibly vast and terrifyingly empty, carrying with her a single question that burned brighter than her fear. What secret was hidden in the one thing her past had left behind? Emma had returned to St. Agnes one final time, not as a resident, but as a ghost revisiting the only home she had ever known, to use the ancient desktop computer in the small library that smelled of old books and lemon furniture polish. Her fingers trembled on the keyboard as she typed the faint address she could barely make out on the key's tag, the numbers and letters worn almost to illegibility by time and handling by unknown hands. The search results loaded slowly, the screen flickering with information that made her breath catch in her throat. A 40-acre parcel of land in Darby, Montana, in the Bitterroot Valley, the property listed under her full legal name, Emma Rose Thornton, a surname she had never known belonged to her until this moment. The satellite images showed a small structure surrounded by dense trees, fields overtaken by wild grass, and what appeared to be the collapsed skeleton of a barn, all of it looking like a place the world had forgotten, abandoned to the quiet patience of nature. With the address written on a scrap of paper clutched in her hand, Emma counted the money she had saved from 3 years of part-time work at the town library. Just over $400 that represented every birthday gift, every holiday check, every hour of shelving books while her peers were living normal teenage lives. She bought a bus ticket at the Greyhound station, the clerk barely looking at her as he handed over the thin slip of paper that would carry her 3 hours north into mountains she had only ever seen in photographs, into a past she had never been allowed to claim. The bus departed in the grey light of early morning, its diesel engine rumbling as it pulled away from the only town Emma had ever known, leaving behind the spire of St. Agnes, visible in the rear view until distance, and hills swallowed it completely. She sat by the window, her canvas bag clutched on her lap, watching the landscape transform with each passing mile, the flat agricultural plains giving way to rolling hills, then to steeper terrain, where ponderosa pines began to climb the slopes like dark green flames. The other passengers were few, mostly silent travelers, absorbed in their phones or sleeping against the rattling windows, none of them aware that the thin young woman in the second-hand coat was traveling toward the only clue she had ever possessed about who she really was. As the bus climbed higher into the mountains, Emma felt her heart beating faster, a mixture of hope and fear that made her stomach clench and her hands grip the rusted key until her knuckles were white. The Bitterroot Range rose on either side of the highway, massive peaks still crowned with snow despite the November date, their granite faces ancient and impassive, like guardians of secrets that had been kept for far too long. The mountains seemed to watch her journey with indifference, these towering sentinels that had stood long before her story began, and would remain long after it ended, witnesses to whatever truth waited at the end of this road. The bus driver announced Darby as the vehicle slowed, pulling into a small station that was little more than a covered bench and a faded sign, and Emma gathered her bag, her legs unsteady, as she stepped down onto the cracked asphalt of a town that might hold the answers to questions she had carried her entire life, surrounded by wilderness that felt both beautiful and somehow threatening, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would uncover. The address led Emma down a rutted dirt road that branched off the main highway, the path so overgrown with weeds and saplings that she wondered if anyone had driven it in years, and after 20 minutes of walking with her bag growing heavier with each step, she finally saw it through a break in the pine trees, a small farmhouse that looked as though it had been slowly surrendering to the wilderness for nearly 2 decades. The structure was a simple single-story building with weathered grey siding, its paint long since stripped away by Montana winters and summer sun, the windows dark and covered with grime or boards, the front porch sagging dangerously on one side, where the support posts had rotted through. Emma approached slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and profound sadness, because this place, forgotten and forlorn, was somehow connected to her, to the people who had given her life, and then disappeared, leaving her with nothing but questions and a rusted key. The front door was unlocked, swinging open on protesting hinges to reveal an interior thick with dust and the musty smell of abandonment. A few pieces of simple furniture still in place, as if the occupant had simply walked away mid-life and never returned. But Emma's attention was drawn past the house to what remained of the barn, a collapsed structure of weathered wood and corrugated metal about 50 yards behind the farmhouse, its roof caved in on one side, its walls leaning at impossible angles. She made her way through knee-high grass that had once been a yard, grasshoppers leaping away from her footsteps, and ducked through the barn's broken doorway into a space filled with shafts of dusty sunlight that fell through the gaps in the roof. There, in the center of the collapsed structure, like an altar in a ruined cathedral, sat the tractor. It was a vintage John Deere 4020, its iconic green paint faded to a dull olive and covered with patches of rust that bloomed across its metal surfaces like orange flowers, thick vines of wild grape and ivy winding through its wheels and up around its engine housing, as if nature had been trying to pull it down into the earth. Emma approached it slowly, the key clutched in her hand, and as she drew closer, she began to notice details that made her skin prickle with unease and confusion. The tractor's fuel tank, which should have been a simple metal cylinder with a cap for refilling, had been completely sealed, the top welded shut with crude but effective metalwork that had clearly been done by someone who wanted to ensure it could never be opened easily. The seat, which should have been a simple padded platform, had been removed entirely and replaced with a heavy metal box, approximately 2 feet square and a foot deep, secured to the tractor's frame with bolts and fitted with a serious padlock that looked military-grade, far beyond anything a farmer would use to protect tools or spare parts. Emma climbed up onto the tractor's worn step plate, her hands gripping the steering wheel that was cold and rough with rust, and examined the metal box more closely, her mind racing with questions that multiplied faster than she could process them. Why would someone weld shut a fuel tank? What could possibly be inside this box that required such security? The tractor clearly hadn't been used in years, maybe decades, so it wasn't about protecting valuable equipment. She ran her fingers along the welded seams of the fuel tank, feeling the rough beads of metal that someone had laboriously applied, transforming a simple tractor into something else entirely, a puzzle or a vault or a message she didn't yet know how to read, and she understood with absolute certainty that nothing about her inheritance was simple or accidental, that this rusted machine held secrets someone had been desperate to preserve. Emma was so absorbed in examining the strange modifications to the tractor that she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until a voice, weathered and sharp with surprise, called out from the barn's entrance. "Lord have mercy! There's actually someone at the Thornton place!" Emma spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, to find an elderly woman standing in the shaft of sunlight that fell through the broken doorway, her silhouette backlit and ghostly until she stepped forward into the barn's dim interior. The woman was in her 70s, her face a map of deep lines carved by decades of mountain sun and wind, her white hair pulled back in a practical bun, her body still strong and upright despite her age, dressed in work jeans and a flannel shirt that spoke of a life spent on the land. Her pale blue eyes were sharp and assessing, moving from Emma's face to the tractor and back again with an expression that combined shock, curiosity, and something that looked almost like fear. "I'm Martha Reeves," the woman said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through enough years to have earned the right to speak plainly. "I own the property just east of here. Been there 50 years come spring. I saw smoke from what I thought was an empty house and came to investigate. Who are you, child, and what are you doing at this place?" Emma climbed down from the tractor, suddenly aware of how she must look, a thin young woman with a canvas bag and wild hope in her eyes, trespassing on abandoned property. "My name is Emma," she said, pulling the key from her pocket and holding it out as if it were proof of her right to be here. "Emma Rose Thornton. This property is deeded in my name. I just found out about it yesterday, when I left the orphanage where I grew up." The effect of her words on Martha was immediate and profound, the old woman's face going pale, her hand reaching out to grip the barn's doorframe, as if she needed support. "Thornton," Martha whispered, the name seeming to carry weight and sorrow. "Sweet Jesus, you're Sarah's daughter." The confirmation hit Emma like a physical blow, the first time in her life anyone had connected her to a real person, a woman with a name. "Sarah Thornton owned this farm," Martha continued, her voice thick with emotion and old grief. "She was a beautiful young woman, maybe 25 years old, a botanist or environmental scientist, something like that, always taking soil samples and testing water from the creek. She moved here about 20 years ago, kept to herself mostly, but she was kind, would wave when I drove past, would help if you needed something. Then about 18 years ago, I realized I hadn't seen her in weeks. No lights in the house, no truck in the driveway. When I finally got the sheriff to check, she was just gone, vanished without a trace. Her truck was missing, some of her clothes were gone, but most of her things were still here, like she'd left in a hurry or been taken." Martha's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Emma, really looked at her, seeing not just a stranger, but a ghost of someone she had known. "The rumors in town said she'd been pregnant, that she'd given birth, and then disappeared. They searched for months, dragged the river, combed these mountains, but they never found her or any baby. Eventually, they declared her legally dead. But you're telling me you're her daughter, that you survived?" Emma nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Martha stepped closer, her weathered hand reaching out to touch Emma's cheek with surprising gentleness. "Then you need to be careful, child," she said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Because some people in this town, powerful people, they won't be happy you're here, asking questions about what happened to your mother." Martha led Emma back to her own property, a well-maintained farmhouse with a neat barn and organized shed, moving with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had spent a lifetime solving practical problems, and she returned carrying heavy-duty bolt cutters that looked like they could shear through anything. They walked back to the Thornton place in silence, Emma's mind reeling with the revelation that she had a name now, Sarah Thornton, a mother who had been real and alive and had vanished under circumstances that clearly troubled the old woman walking beside her. Back in the ruined barn, Emma climbed onto the tractor while Martha stood watch, her presence somehow both comforting and making the moment more real, more significant, as Emma positioned the bolt cutters around the padlock's thick shackle. It took all her strength and Martha's instruction on proper leverage, but finally, the lock gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the barn like a gunshot, and Emma's hands were shaking as she lifted the metal box's lid, half afraid of what she might find, half afraid she would find nothing at all. Inside the box, protected from the elements and time, was a large waterproof container, the kind used by serious hikers or people who needed to keep documents safe in extreme conditions, its seal still intact after 18 years. Emma lifted it out carefully, her breath coming in short gasps, and with Martha's weathered hand on her shoulder for support, she opened the container's latches. The first thing she saw was a photograph, and the world seemed to tilt and blur as she looked at it, because staring back at her was a young woman with dark hair and eyes exactly like her own, holding a newborn baby wrapped in a pale yellow blanket, the woman's face radiant with a fierce protective love that transcended the fading colors of the old photograph. Emma turned the picture over with trembling fingers, and there, in careful handwriting that looked rushed but deliberate, were words that made tears stream down her face. "Emma Rose, my everything. If you're reading this, I'm gone. The truth is in the soil." The date on the photograph was 18 years ago to the month, and Emma understood she was looking at the only picture that would ever exist of her mother holding her, moment captured and hidden away, like a message in a bottle cast into an ocean of time. Beneath the photograph was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with dense handwriting and scientific notations, and a thick stack of official-looking documents, soil sample reports from various laboratories, with letterheads from environmental testing companies in Missoula and Bozeman. The pages covered with columns of numbers and chemical analyses that meant nothing to Emma, but clearly had meant everything to her mother. Martha leaned closer, her experienced eyes scanning the laboratory reports, and Emma saw the old woman's face harden with recognition and anger. "These are contamination reports," Martha said quietly, her finger tracing down a column of numbers. "Look at these levels. Arsenic, lead, industrial solvents, all far above safe limits. Your mother was testing the soil and water around here, and she found something bad enough that someone wanted to make sure she never told anyone about it." Emma held the photograph close to her chest, feeling the weight of her mother's sacrifice, understanding that she had been hidden not out of abandonment, but out of desperate love, that somewhere in this journal and these reports was a truth so dangerous that it had cost Sarah Thornton her life, and had left Emma alone in the world, and now that truth was hers to uncover, hers to finish. Emma carried the waterproof container back to the farmhouse as twilight fell across the valley, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, and she refused Martha's offer to stay at her place, needing to be here in this house where her mother had lived and worked and made the impossible decision to give up her child. She built a small fire in the old stone fireplace, using wood Martha had brought, the flames casting dancing shadows across walls that still held the ghost of her mother's presence. And as the November night grew cold and dark around her, Emma opened Sarah Thornton's journal and began to read by the light of the fire and a battery-powered lantern Martha had insisted she take. The journal began, mundanely enough, dated entries from nearly 20 years ago, documenting Sarah's work as an environmental scientist, her excitement at securing the small farm as both a home and a research base, her meticulous notes about soil composition and water quality in the Bitterroot Valley. But as Emma turned the pages, her mother's tone shifted, excitement giving way to concern, and then to alarm as Sarah documented her discovery that something was terribly wrong with the land surrounding certain areas of the valley. The entries grew more detailed and more disturbing. Sarah had been conducting routine soil and water sampling as part of a broader Montana state environmental study when she noticed unusual chemical signatures in samples taken from wetlands and creek beds in the northern part of the valley. She had sent samples to independent laboratories, paying out of her own pocket when official channels seemed to drag their feet or lose her paperwork, and the results had come back showing catastrophic levels of industrial contamination, chemicals that had no business being in protected wilderness areas. Sarah wrote with growing anger and fear about how she had traced the contamination to its source, conducting night surveys with a GPS unit and camera, documenting how trucks from Bridgewater Agricultural Corporation, a massive agribusiness conglomerate with operations throughout Montana, were making regular midnight runs to remote locations, dumping drums of toxic waste into ravines and wetlands where they thought no one would ever look. She had photographed the trucks, collected samples from the dump sites, matched the chemical signatures to known industrial waste products, and built what she called in her journal an airtight case that will bring them down. But then the tone of the entries changed again, becoming more personal, as Sarah wrote about discovering she was pregnant, about the joy and terror of that realization, about how she had initially planned to publish her findings immediately, but then began to fear for her unborn child's safety. She documented incidents of harassment that started slowly, but escalated quickly. Her truck's tires slashed, her mailbox destroyed, strange vehicles parked on the road watching her house, and most chillingly, a visit from men who claimed to be from Bridgewater's legal department, who told her in very polite terms that environmental activists who made false accusations often found themselves sued into poverty or worse. Sarah's handwriting grew more hurried and anxious as the pregnancy progressed, her entries filled with anguish about what to do, how to protect both her child and the truth she had uncovered. And Emma read through tears as her mother wrote, "I thought I could do both, be a scientist and a mother, expose the truth, and raise my baby in safety. But I was naive. They're watching me constantly now. I see the same trucks circling, the same faces in town. They know I'm pregnant, and I've realized with absolute horror that they're waiting, that they plan to use my child as leverage to silence me, or worse, to eliminate us both and make it look like a tragic accident. I have to make an impossible choice. I can try to go public now and put my baby at immediate risk, or I can hide the evidence, hide my child, and hope that someday, somehow, the truth will survive, even if I don't." Emma read deeper into the journal as the fire burned low and the night grew colder, her mother's words becoming more desperate and more strategic as Sarah Thornton transformed from a frightened pregnant woman into a warrior preparing for a battle she knew she might not survive. The entries from the final months of her pregnancy detailed an elaborate plan, written in a mixture of scientific precision and maternal anguish, describing how Sarah had decided to turn the old John Deere tractor into a vault, a time capsule that would preserve her evidence until someone trustworthy could find it. She wrote about teaching herself to weld, practicing on scrap metal in the barn until she could create a seal strong enough to protect the tractor's fuel tank from the elements and from anyone who might think to look inside such an obvious hiding place. Sarah documented every step of the process, draining the fuel tank completely, cleaning it with solvents to remove any residue, lining it with waterproof material, and then carefully placing inside it every piece of evidence she had compiled over 18 months of investigation. The original soil samples sealed in laboratory vials, the water testing results, internal Bridgewater memos she had obtained from a sympathetic employee, photographs of the midnight dumping operations, and a detailed map marking every contamination site with GPS coordinates. She described welding the tank shut in the middle of the night, working by flashlight while 7 months pregnant, her hands shaking with effort and fear, knowing that this act would preserve the truth, even if she couldn't. The metal box on the tractor seat had been a secondary measure, containing the journal and photograph and basic evidence for whoever might find it first, a breadcrumb trail leading to the real treasure, hidden within the machine itself. Sarah's plan, as she laid it out in increasingly frantic entries, was brutally simple and heartbreaking in its clarity. She would give birth in secret with the help of a midwife she trusted, hide the baby somewhere safe, where Bridgewater could never find her, and then immediately go public with her evidence, accepting that doing so would likely cost her life, but hoping that the resulting investigation would be so public, so massive, that her child would be safe in the aftermath. Emma's hands trembled as she read her mother's words. "I've arranged everything. The midwife will come when it's time. I've already picked the place where I'll leave Emma, a place far enough away that they'll never connect her to me. It will destroy me to let her go, but it's the only way to keep her alive. Once she's safe, I'll take the evidence to the newspapers in Missoula and Helena simultaneously, send copies to the EPA and FBI, make so much noise that they can't silence it. They might kill me, probably will, but the truth will be out there, and my daughter will live." But the final entries grew confused and frightened, dated just days before Emma's birth, describing how the harassment had intensified, how Sarah feared they had discovered her plan, how she wondered if she had waited too long. The last entry was dated the day Emma was born, according to the photograph, and it was written in a shaking hand that suggested exhaustion or fear, or both. "She's here. Emma Rose. She's perfect. She has my eyes. I can hear trucks on the road outside. They're coming. I have to get her to safety right now. Tonight. Can't wait for morning, like I planned. If you're reading this, my daughter, know that I loved you more than truth, more than justice, more than my own." The sentence ended there, the pen trailing off the page, and Emma stared at those incomplete words, with tears streaming down her face. understanding that whatever had happened next had happened so quickly, so violently, that her mother never had the chance to finish writing, never had the chance to complete her plan. And the question of what went wrong in those final moments hung in the cold air of the farmhouse, like a ghost demanding answers. Emma woke at dawn after barely sleeping, her mother's incomplete final sentence echoing in her mind, and she found Martha already at the farmhouse with a pickup truck containing welding equipment and a portable generator. The old woman had clearly spent the night making preparations, her face set with the same grim determination Emma felt, understanding that opening the fuel tank was not just about satisfying curiosity, but about finishing what Sarah Thornton had started 18 years ago. They worked together in the cold morning air, dragging the generator into the collapsed barn, Martha demonstrating how to use the cutting torch with the confidence of someone who had spent decades doing her own farm repairs. Emma put on the heavy protective mask and gloves, her hands steadier than she expected, as she ignited the torch and began cutting carefully along the welded seam her mother had created so long ago, the bright flame turning metal molten and peeling back the seal that had protected its secrets through nearly 2 decades of Montana weather. The work was slow and painstaking, taking nearly 2 hours to cut around the entire circumference of the fuel tank's sealed top. And when Emma finally pried the circular cap free, she and Martha both peered inside to find layer upon layer of heavy-duty waterproof material, the kind used for long-term storage in extreme conditions. They carefully lifted out the wrapped bundle, its weight substantial, and carried it to a clear space on the barn floor, where the morning sunlight fell through gaps in the collapsed roof. As they unwrapped the layers, Emma's breath caught, because inside was exactly what Sarah had promised in her journal, a complete, meticulously documented case against Bridgewater Agricultural Corporation. There were dozens of glass vials containing soil samples, each one labeled with a date, GPS coordinates, and sample identification number. The dark earth inside them looking innocent, but containing evidence of poisoning. There were water testing results from 3 different independent laboratories, their official letterheads and stamps lending credibility to the shocking contamination levels documented in column after column of data. There were internal Bridgewater memos printed on company letterhead, presumably stolen or leaked by someone inside the corporation, discussing disposal costs and explicitly mentioning dumping schedules for what they euphemistically called agricultural byproducts in locations they knew were protected wetlands. There were photographs, dozens of them, showing Bridgewater trucks at night with their distinctive corporate logos visible, men in company uniforms rolling barrels into ravines, and wide shots showing the dump sites' locations relative to identifiable landmarks. And finally, there was a large topographical map of the entire Bitterroot Valley, marked with red circles and detailed notes in Sarah's precise handwriting, each circle representing a contamination site, with arrows showing how the toxins would flow through groundwater systems toward the wells and creeks that provided drinking water to hundreds of families throughout the valley. Emma and Martha spread everything out on the barn floor, and the old woman's face grew harder and angrier as she examined each piece of evidence. "This is exactly what your mother died for," Martha said quietly, her weathered hands gentle as she touched the vials and photographs. "This is enough to destroy them." Emma and Martha were carefully repacking the evidence into waterproof containers when a sound made them both freeze, a low rumbling bark from somewhere near the edge of the clearing, followed by the appearance of a large dog emerging from the tree line with cautious, deliberate steps. The animal was a German shepherd mix, his coat a mixture of tan and black that had gone scruffy and unkempt from life in the wild, his body lean but not starved, his intelligent amber eyes fixed on Emma, with an intensity that made her breath catch. Martha let out a soft sound of recognition, setting down the soil samples she had been organizing. "That's Scout," she said quietly, as if afraid of startling the dog. "He's been a stray around these parts for years, longer than I can properly remember. He shows up at this property every few weeks, walks the perimeter like he's checking on something, then disappears back into the forest. Some folks in town feed him when he wanders through, but he never stays with anyone, never lets anyone get too close. He just keeps coming back here, like he's waiting for something or someone." Emma knelt slowly, extending her hand, palm up in a gesture of peace, and the dog approached with careful steps, his nose working as he scented the air, his posture alert but not aggressive. He came close enough to sniff her hand, his wet nose cold against her skin, and then something remarkable happened. The dog's entire demeanor changed, the wariness dropping away as he pressed his head against Emma's palm and let out a soft whine that sounded almost like relief. Emma stroked his rough fur, feeling the solid warmth of him, and the dog leaned into her touch as if he had been starving, not for food, but for this specific contact, this particular person. She shared her sandwich with him, tearing off pieces of turkey and bread that he took gently from her fingers with surprising delicacy for such a large animal, and when she stood to continue working, the dog simply sat at her feet and refused to leave, his eyes following her every movement with devoted attention. As the day wore on, and Emma and Martha worked to organize and document the evidence, Scout remained a constant presence, lying near Emma when she sat, walking beside her, when she moved, pressing against her leg, when she stood still as if offering comfort or protection, or both. Martha watched the interaction with knowing eyes. "I think he might have been your mother's dog," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Sarah had a dog. I remember that now. A young shepherd she'd gotten as a pup not long before she disappeared. After she vanished, some folks reported seeing a stray dog around this property, but no one could catch him. If that's the same animal, he's been waiting here for 18 years, waiting for Sarah to come home. But now he's found you instead, and he knows somehow, the way dogs always know, that you're hers, that you're who he's been waiting for all this time." Emma looked down at Scout, who gazed back at her with eyes that held both ancient patience and new purpose, and she understood that she had found not just evidence of her mother's work, but a living connection to her, a loyal friend who had never stopped keeping watch. Emma was inside the farmhouse the next morning, attempting to organize her mother's evidence into some kind of coherent system that might make sense to authorities, when Scout suddenly rose from his position near the door, a low, warning growl rumbling deep in his chest, his ears forward, and his body tense with alertness that made Emma's own instincts flare with caution. She moved to the grimy window and wiped a clean spot to see through, her heart sinking as she watched an expensive black SUV with tinted windows navigate the rutted driveway with the careful precision of someone unused to rural roads, the vehicle so pristine and out of place it might as well have been a spaceship landing in the overgrown yard. The man who emerged from the driver's seat was in his 40s, tall and fit in the way that came from expensive gym memberships rather than physical labor, dressed in a tailored wool coat over business casual clothes that probably cost more than Emma had spent on clothing in her entire life, his dark hair perfectly styled, his face handsome in a polished corporate way that immediately set her on edge. He approached the farmhouse with confident strides, a warm professional smile already fixed on his face, and knocked on the door with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being welcomed everywhere he went. Emma opened the door, but kept Scout beside her, the dog's presence solid and reassuring, his growl continuous and menacing in a way that made the man's smile falter slightly. "Good morning," the man said, his voice smooth and pleasant, extending a hand that Emma did not take. "My name is Derek Carlyle. I'm the Regional Acquisitions Director for Bridgewater Agricultural Corporation. I apologize for dropping by unannounced, but I heard through the county records office that this property has finally cleared its legal complications, and I wanted to reach out to the new owner immediately with what I think is a very generous offer." His eyes moved past Emma to the interior of the house, cataloguing everything he could see, and she noticed how his gaze lingered on the waterproof container she had foolishly left visible on the table. "I'm not interested in selling," Emma said flatly, her hand dropping to rest on Scout's head, feeling the vibration of his growl through her palm. Carlyle's smile never wavered, though his eyes grew harder, colder, like chips of blue ice. "You haven't even heard my offer yet. Bridgewater is looking to expand our agricultural operations in this valley, and this property, while small and in poor condition, happens to be in a location that would be very useful to us. I'm authorized to offer you $200,000 cash for the land and all structures. That's an extraordinary amount for 40 acres of marginal farmland with a house that's barely standing. You could take that money, start a new life anywhere you want, go to college, see the world, anything you dream of." The offer was absurd, 10 times what the property could possibly be worth on the open market, and Emma understood immediately that he was not buying land, but buying silence, trying to remove her and whatever she might have found before she could become a problem. "The answer is no," Emma said, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. Carlyle's smile finally died, replaced by an expression of cold calculation. "That's disappointing," he said quietly, his voice losing its warm professional tone and becoming something much more sinister. "You should understand that young women living alone in isolated places like this, well, unfortunate accidents happen all the time. A fire, a fall, a wild animal attack, so many tragic possibilities. It would be terrible if something happened to you before you've had a chance to really experience life, especially since you've already been through so much, growing up in that orphanage, without anyone who cared about you." The threat was clear and unmistakable, and Scout's growl intensified into a deep bark, his body tensing as if preparing to attack. Carlyle took a step back, his eyes on the dog, then looked at Emma one final time. "Think carefully about my offer, Miss Thornton, because I won't be making it again," he said, and then he turned and walked back to his pristine SUV, leaving Emma standing in the doorway, with her heart pounding, and the absolute certainty that the danger her mother had fled from 18 years ago had just found her. Derek Carlyle's SUV had barely disappeared down the rutted driveway when another vehicle appeared. This one, a Gallatin County Sheriff's Department patrol car that moved slowly up the drive, as if the driver already knew exactly where he was going. And Emma felt her stomach clench with dread as she realized Bridgewater was not wasting any time escalating their pressure. The man who emerged from the patrol car was in his late 50s, heavy-set with a thick neck and the florid face of someone who spent too much time with a bottle, his sheriff's uniform straining across his belly, his eyes small and mean beneath the brim of his hat. Scout immediately positioned himself between Emma and the approaching officer, his lips pulling back from his teeth in a silent snarl, and the growl that started in his chest was different from the warning he had given Carlyle, deeper and more primal, a sound of pure instinctive hatred that made the sheriff stop several feet away from the porch. "I'm Sheriff Wade Brennan," the man announced, his hand resting on his service weapon in a gesture that was clearly meant to intimidate. "I've received complaints about trespassing on this property, and I'm here to investigate." Emma felt anger flare through her fear. "I own this property," she said, keeping her voice level. "The deed is in my name, legally transferred through the county. I'm not trespassing on my own land." Brennan's expression made it clear he already knew that this entire visit was theatre performed for Bridgewater's benefit. "I heard Derek Carlyle made you a generous offer for this place," he said, his tone making it clear this was not a casual observation, but a coordinated message. "Bridgewater Agricultural has been very good to this county, Miss Thornton. They employ hundreds of people. They sponsor our schools and our hospital. They're important to this community, and when they want something, well, folks around here tend to be cooperative." Scout's growl intensified, a continuous menacing rumble that made Brennan's hand tighten on his weapon. "You need to control that animal," the sheriff said, his voice rising. "That's a dangerous dog, and I could have him put down for threatening a law enforcement officer." Emma placed her hand on Scout's head, feeling the tension vibrating through him, but she did not try to silence his warning. He's protecting his home and his owner, she said quietly. Maybe if you weren't making threats, he wouldn't feel the need. Brennan's face darkened with anger, but he seemed unwilling to push the confrontation further, with the dog standing ready to attack. You're making a mistake staying here, he said, his voice dropping to something uglier than official authority. Smart people take good deals when they're offered. Stubborn people, especially young women who don't know anything about how the world works, they tend to regret their choices. You think about that tonight, when you're alone in this falling-down house, miles from help, with nothing but a stray dog for protection. He turned and walked back to his patrol car, and Scout's growling did not stop until the vehicle had disappeared completely from view. Martha arrived at the farmhouse within an hour of the sheriff's departure, her face grim and resolved, carrying a thermos of hot coffee and the weight of a secret she had carried for 18 years, and she sat across from Emma at the old wooden table while Scout lay protectively at Emma's feet, still agitated from the morning's confrontations. The old woman's weathered hands trembled slightly as she poured the coffee, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion and old guilt. I need to tell you the truth about the night you were born, Martha began, her pale eyes meeting Emma's directly. I've kept this secret because I was afraid, because I convinced myself it was the right thing to do, but you deserve to know what really happened. It was 18 years ago, late October, a cold night with the first real frost. I heard screaming coming from this farm around midnight, terrible screaming that cut through the darkness, and I called the sheriff's office, but they said they'd send someone when they could, which I knew meant never, not for Sarah Thornton, who had made powerful enemies. So I grabbed my late husband's shotgun and drove over here myself, my heart pounding, because I knew something awful was happening. By the time I got here, maybe 15 minutes after the screaming stopped, Sarah's truck was gone, and the house was completely dark, every light off, the front door standing open like a mouth. I called out but got no answer, and I was about to leave, thinking maybe Sarah had driven herself to the hospital, when I heard it. A baby crying, coming from the barn. I found you in a feed box, wrapped in that yellow blanket from the photograph, and you were maybe hours old, still had the cord attached, but tied off professionally, like someone who knew what they were doing. Beside you was a note written in Sarah's handwriting on a page torn from her journal, and it said, "Please, whoever finds her, take her somewhere far away and safe. They're coming for us both. Don't tell anyone where you found her. Her name is Emma Rose. Tell her I loved her more than life." I stood there holding you, this tiny, perfect baby, and I heard vehicles on the road, saw headlights sweeping through the trees, and I knew they were coming back to search, to make sure Sarah hadn't left any evidence behind. I ran to my truck with you, drove through back roads with my lights off, and I didn't stop until I reached St. Agnes Orphanage 3 counties away, far enough that no one would connect a foundling baby to a missing woman in another part of Montana. I left you on their steps before dawn, with just the blanket and that note, nothing that could identify where you'd come from, because I was terrified that if Bridgewater found out Sarah had a child, they'd kill you too. Martha's voice broke completely, tears streaming down her weathered face. I saved your life that night, but I've spent 18 years wondering if I should have fought harder, should have gone to the FBI or the newspapers, should have finished what your mother started instead of just hiding you away and letting them win. Emma woke to Scout's frantic barking, a sound of pure alarm that cut through her exhausted sleep like a blade, and before she was fully conscious, she smelled it. The acrid stench of smoke and the chemical sweetness of accelerant, gasoline, or kerosene, poured liberally and set ablaze. She stumbled from the makeshift bed she had created on the farmhouse floor, Scout already at the door scratching desperately to get out, and when she opened it, the night exploded in orange and yellow, the barn fully engulfed in flames that reached toward the black sky like grasping fingers, the heat so intense she could feel it from 50 yards away. Her first thought was for the evidence, and her heart nearly stopped, before she remembered that she and Martha had moved everything into the farmhouse basement that afternoon, a decision made from paranoia that now seemed like divine intervention. Scout barked again, this time directing her attention not toward the fire, but away from it, toward the tree line, where she could see headlights retreating down the access road, whoever had set this blaze not bothering to stay and watch their work. Emma ran back inside, grabbed the fireproof box containing the most critical documents and her mother's journal, and she and Scout retreated to a safe distance to watch the barn collapse in on itself, the ancient dried wood burning with such ferocity that she knew this was not an accidental fire, but arson, professionally done with enough accelerant to ensure total destruction. The volunteer fire department arrived 30 minutes later, but by then there was nothing left to save, just a smoking foundation and twisted metal that glowed red in the darkness, and the fire chief, a decent man named Morrison, who seemed genuinely concerned, told her it was obviously arson, and that he would file a report, though his expression said he doubted anything would come of it. After the firefighters left, and the first grey light of dawn began to creep across the valley, Emma and Scout walked carefully through the smoking ruins, and it was Scout who found it, nosing at a partially melted piece of plastic and metal that Emma recognized with a jolt of hope as the trail camera she had purchased in town 2 days ago and hidden in the rafters of the barn, a cheap security measure she had taken on Martha's advice. The camera's casing was warped and blackened, but when Emma pried it open with shaking fingers, the SD card inside was intact, protected by the camera's internal compartments. She ran back to the farmhouse, her heart pounding, and plugged the card into Martha's old laptop, and what she saw on the grainy footage made her hands clench into fists. 2 men, their faces clearly visible in the camera's night vision, wearing Bridgewater Agricultural Corporation, uniforms with the company logo visible on their jackets, methodically pouring liquid from large containers around the barn's perimeter, before one of them lit a road flare and tossed it into the accelerant. The explosion of flame washing out the camera's sensor in the final seconds before the device melted. She had them now, not just on contamination charges, but on arson, on attempted murder, caught in the act by technology they had not known existed. Emma spent the morning after the fire going through every piece of paper in the waterproof containers with meticulous care, organizing and cataloguing her mother's evidence, while Scout kept watch at the window, still agitated and protective after the night's violence. It was while sorting through a stack of personal documents that she found it, a small brass key taped to the back of Sarah's birth certificate, the kind used for safe deposit boxes, with a number stamped into its surface and a faded paper tag reading, First Mountain Bank, Hamilton. Hamilton was 2 towns over, about 40 miles south, far enough that Sarah had clearly wanted whatever was in that box to be separate from her daily life, hidden in a location that even people watching her closely might not think to check. Emma borrowed Martha's truck, unwilling to wait another moment, and made the drive with Scout sitting alert in the passenger seat, his presence a comfort as they navigated the winding mountain roads. The bank was a small brick building on Hamilton's main street, old-fashioned and solid, and the manager, a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Chen, seemed genuinely sympathetic when Emma explained that she was Sarah Thornton's daughter and had legal documentation proving the property and all assets had been transferred to her name. Mrs. Chen led her to the vault, a secure room lined with metal boxes, and used the bank's master key in combination with Emma's key to open box number 237, which Sarah had rented 20 years ago and paid for in advance for 30 years, as if she had known she might not be around to renew it. Inside the narrow metal drawer were 3 items that made Emma's hands tremble as she lifted them out. Her birth certificate, official and legal, listing Emma Rose Thornton as born on October 28th, 18 years ago, to Sarah Elizabeth Thornton, with the father listed simply as unknown, giving Emma the final confirmation of her identity and her mother's name. Beneath that was a legal document, Sarah's last will and testament, notarized and properly executed, leaving all property, assets, and possessions to her daughter Emma Rose with instructions that if Emma could not be located, everything should be sold and the proceeds donated to environmental protection organizations. And finally, there was a sealed envelope, thick and substantial, addressed in Sarah's careful handwriting to Thomas Whitmore, Environmental Protection Agency, Region 8, Denver, Colorado. With urgent federal crimes written across the top. Emma's hands shook as she carefully opened the envelope, finding inside a 10-page letter that was essentially a full confession, a detailed account of everything Sarah had discovered about Bridgewater's illegal dumping, including specific dates, locations, chemical analyses, and witness statements from employees who had spoken to her anonymously. The letter was a plea for help, for federal intervention, for protection for herself and her unborn child, dated 3 weeks before Emma's birth, and it had never been sent, never reached the man who might have saved Sarah's life, sitting instead in this metal box as a ghost of what might have been, waiting 18 years for someone to find it and finish what Sarah had started. Emma returned to the farmhouse and used Martha's laptop to search for Thomas Whitmore, her mother's unsent letter sitting beside her, like a connection to a past that might have been different if only Sarah had mailed it. And what she found gave her the first real hope she had felt since this nightmare began. Thomas Whitmore was listed as a retired EPA senior investigator, now 63 years old, living in Missoula, with a contact email for environmental consulting work he still did occasionally. And Emma composed a message that was direct and desperate, explaining who she was, what she had found, and asking if he would meet with her as soon as possible. His response came within 2 hours, a single line that contained both shock and urgency. "I'll be home all day tomorrow. Come immediately. I've been waiting 18 years for someone to contact me about Sarah Thornton." The drive to Missoula the next morning took 3 hours through mountain passes still dusted with early snow, Scout Alert in the passenger seat, and Emma clutched the steering wheel with white knuckles, terrified and hopeful in equal measure, carrying with her the waterproof case containing copies of all the evidence and the original unsent letter. Whitmore's house was a modest, craftsman-style home in an older neighborhood, with a well-tended garden and solar panels on the roof, and the man who answered her knock was tall and lean with silver hair and intelligent grey eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, his face lined with age and what looked like old grief. He stared at Emma for a long moment, his expression transforming from curiosity to shock, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "You look exactly like her," he said quietly. "You have Sarah's eyes, her face, everything. Come in, please, both of you." Inside, surrounded by bookshelves filled with environmental science texts and framed photographs of wilderness areas, Whitmore listened with absolute attention as Emma told him everything: the orphanage, the key, the evidence in the tractor, the journal, the threats from Bridgewater, and finally, she handed him the letter Sarah had written, but never sent. He read it with hands that trembled, tears streaming down his weathered face, and when he finished, he sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "Sarah and I were colleagues at the EPA," he began, his voice heavy with old pain. "She was brilliant, passionate, one of the best environmental scientists I ever worked with. When she left the agency to do independent consulting in Montana, we stayed in touch, exchanged emails regularly about her research. She had contacted me about 6 months before she disappeared, told me she was investigating something big, something that involved serious corporate malfeasance, and she said she was compiling evidence. Then her emails just stopped completely in October 18 years ago. I tried calling, sent messages, even drove out to Montana to check on her, but she was gone, her farm abandoned, and the local sheriff told me she had probably just moved away without telling anyone. I knew something was wrong. I felt it in my gut, but I had no proof, no evidence, nothing to justify a federal investigation. I've thought about her constantly over the years, wondered what happened, blamed myself for not pushing harder." He looked at Emma with eyes full of determination and rage. They killed her, didn't they? Bridgewater killed her because she was about to expose them, and now they're trying to kill you, too. But this time, I'm not going to fail. This time, we're going to finish what Sarah started." Whitmore led Emma to what he called his war room, a converted spare bedroom lined with filing cabinets and cork boards, covered with maps, photographs, and documents connected by red strings like a detective's conspiracy wall, and Emma realized with a start that this man had never stopped investigating, had spent 18 years pursuing Bridgewater, even without the evidence he needed to make a case. "I've been documenting their operations across 3 states, Whitmore explained, his voice carrying the intensity of a man whose life's work had finally found its purpose. "After Sarah disappeared, I couldn't let it go. Couldn't accept the official story that she just vanished. I started investigating Bridgewater independently, on my own time, using my contacts and my knowledge of environmental regulations. I found patterns, anomalies in their waste disposal reports, discrepancies in their water usage permits, locations where contamination showed up, but the source was never identified. But I never had the physical evidence, the smoking gun that would let me bring federal charges. I had suspicions and circumstantial connections, but nothing that would survive in court against Bridgewater's army of corporate lawyers." Emma opened the waterproof case and began laying out the contents on Whitmore's large work table. The soil samples in their carefully labeled vials, the water testing results from independent laboratories, the internal Bridgewater memos discussing illegal disposal, the photographs of midnight dumping operations, and Sarah's detailed map marking every contamination site. Whitmore's hands moved over the evidence with reverence and growing excitement, his trained eye immediately recognizing the significance of what he was seeing. "This is extraordinary," he breathed, picking up one of the laboratory reports and examining it closely. "These contamination levels are catastrophic, and the fact that she had them tested by 3 different independent labs means they can't be dismissed as errors or anomalies. These memos are from Bridgewater executives explicitly discussing illegal dumping, which establishes corporate knowledge and intent. And these photographs with visible company logos and identifiable employees create a direct chain of evidence linking the corporation to specific criminal acts. Sarah built a perfect case, absolutely airtight." They spent the next 6 hours cataloging everything systematically, Whitmore photographing each piece of evidence, scanning every document, and creating a comprehensive digital archive while maintaining the physical evidence in its original condition, explaining to Emma that chain of custody was critical for federal prosecution. He made meticulous notes about where each item had been found, the conditions of storage, and Emma's legal ownership of the property, building the foundation for evidence that would be admissible in federal court. As the winter afternoon faded to evening, Whitmore sat at his computer and began making calls, using secure lines to contact people he described as trusted colleagues who had survived the political pressures that sometimes compromised environmental enforcement. Emma listened as he spoke with an EPA investigator named Richardson and an FBI agent named Chen, both of whom he had worked with for decades, explaining the situation in careful detail and arranging for encrypted transfer of the preliminary evidence. "They're coming tomorrow," Whitmore said after ending the final call, his face showing a satisfaction Emma had not seen before. "FBI and EPA, a joint task force. They're going to open a formal investigation into Bridgewater Agricultural Corporation for environmental crimes, and with what Sarah left us, they're going to bring federal charges that will destroy that company and put everyone involved in prison for the rest of their lives. Your mother's death won't be in vain, Emma. We're going to finish what she started, and we're going to make sure the whole world knows what she sacrificed to protect this valley." The drive back to the farm from Missoula should have felt triumphant, filled with hope that justice was finally coming for her mother, and for the valley Bridgewater had poisoned. But as Emma navigated the winding mountain highway in the gathering dusk with Scout Alert beside her, she felt only a growing sense of unease that proved justified when the pickup truck appeared in her rearview mirror. At first, it was just another vehicle on the remote road, its headlights bright in the dimming light. But as Emma took the turnoff toward Derby, the truck followed, and when she slowed, it slowed, maintaining a constant distance that was too deliberate to be coincidence. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel, her heart beginning to race as she understood she was being followed, being hunted, and Scout sensed her fear, rising from his seated position to press his nose against the window, a low growl building in his chest. Emma accelerated, Martha's old truck protesting as she pushed it faster on the curving mountain road, trying to gain distance. But the pickup behind her accelerated too, its powerful engine closing the gap with terrifying ease. The attack came on a sharp curve where the road hugged the mountainside, with a steep drop-off to the right and a wall of rock to the left, the pickup suddenly surging forward and slamming into Martha's truck from behind with tremendous force. The impact whipping Emma's head forward and sending the vehicle skidding toward the cliff's edge. She fought the wheel desperately, her training from her few months of driving barely adequate for this crisis, managing to keep the truck on the road, but unable to prevent the second impact that came harder, more precisely aimed at the rear quarter panel, sending them into a spin that ended with the truck sliding sideways off the road and crashing into a stand of small pine trees that stopped their momentum, but left the vehicle tilted at a dangerous angle, the driver's side door pressed against a tree trunk. Emma's head rang from the impact, blood running from a cut on her forehead where she had struck the steering wheel, and through the cracked windshield she could see the pickup truck that had hit them reversing back up the road, its headlights sweeping across the darkening forest as it prepared to come back and finish what it had started. Scout was barking frantically, pawing at her shoulder, and Emma understood with perfect clarity that if she stayed in the truck, she would die, that whoever was driving that pickup would either shoot her or push the truck over the edge into the ravine below. She forced open the passenger door, which was thankfully on the uphill side, and half fell out onto the ground, her legs shaky and her vision blurred. And Scout was immediately there, grabbing her jacket sleeve in his teeth and pulling her away from the wreck with strength that surprised her. They stumbled into the dense forest as the pickup truck's headlights swept back toward the crash site, Emma's hand gripping Scout's fur as he led her deeper into the darkness beneath the pines, and she could hear the truck stopping, hear doors opening, and men's voices conferring in low tones, hear footsteps crunching on the gravel as they approached the wrecked vehicle. Emma and Scout pressed themselves behind a massive fallen log, her breath coming in gasps that she tried desperately to quiet, and she watched through gaps in the log as two men with flashlights examined the empty truck, their curses carrying clearly in the cold mountain air when they realized she had escaped. The men spent 20 minutes searching the immediate area, their lights sweeping through the forest, coming close enough that Emma could see they were wearing Bridgewater uniforms, and it was only Scout's absolute stillness and silence that kept them from being discovered. Finally, the men gave up their search and drove away, but Emma remained hidden long after the sound of their engine had faded, understanding with cold certainty that Bridgewater would not stop, that they would keep coming until she was dead or gone, and that her window for survival was closing with every passing hour. Emma and Scout spent that night hidden in Martha's barn, the old woman having found them stumbling along the roadside hours after the attack, and Martha's fury at seeing Emma's bruised face and hearing what had happened transformed into a fierce determination that burned brighter than any fear. The next morning, Martha made dozens of phone calls, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived in the valley for 50 years and had earned the right to demand that her neighbors listen, and by evening, the old Methodist church on Main Street was filled with people, families who had lived in the Bitterroot Valley for generations, sitting nervously in the worn wooden pews, unsure why they had been summoned, but responding to the urgency in Martha's voice. Emma stood at the front of the church with Scout at her side, facing perhaps 100 people whose expressions ranged from curious to suspicious to frightened, and she felt the weight of her mother's legacy pressing down on her shoulders as Martha introduced her as Sarah Thornton's daughter, the scientist who had disappeared 18 years ago, and a murmur ran through the crowd as people remembered or heard the story for the first time. Emma began to speak, her voice shaking at first, but growing stronger as she told them about the evidence her mother had hidden, about the soil samples and laboratory reports and photographs that documented years of illegal toxic waste dumping by Bridgewater Agricultural Corporation, and she unrolled Sarah's large topographical map across the altar, the red circles marking contamination sites, stark and damning against the green terrain. As Emma explained what each circle represented, pointing to specific locations and reading the contamination levels her mother had documented, something remarkable began to happen in that church. People started standing up, calling out, making connections that had been invisible to them for years. A woman in her 40s, with tears streaming down her face, stood and said her well was located exactly where one of the red circles indicated, and her daughter had been born with a severe birth defect the doctors could never explain. An elderly man stood and said his wife had died of a rare cancer 3 years ago, and their property bordered another marked site. A young father stood with a trembling voice and said his son had leukemia, and their drinking water came from a spring that Emma's finger was pointing to on the map. One by one, family after family rose to share stories of mysterious illnesses, of cancer clusters that affected multiple households, of chronic conditions that had no apparent cause, of children born with problems that shouldn't exist in a rural valley far from industrial pollution. And the pattern became undeniable as Emma's map aligned perfectly with a constellation of suffering that Bridgewater's poison had created. Martha stood and addressed the crowd with a voice that shook with righteous anger, telling them that they had all been silent for too long, intimidated by Bridgewater's economic power and political connections, afraid to ask questions or demand answers because the corporation employed their neighbors and sponsored their schools. But that silence had cost them their health, their families, their futures. She told them about the attempts on Emma's life, about the fire and the truck that had run her off the road, about how Bridgewater was willing to kill to keep their crimes hidden. And she asked them a simple question. Were they going to keep living in fear, or were they going to stand up and fight for their children and their land? The response was immediate and overwhelming, voices calling out in agreement, people standing and pledging support. And Emma watched as the community that had been fractured and intimidated for nearly 2 decades began to coalesce into something powerful and unified, a force that Bridgewater Agricultural Corporation had never expected to face. The meeting at the church had just ended, people filing out into the cold night air with newfound purpose and determination, when a woman Emma had never seen before approached her with the careful, nervous steps of someone who knew she was taking an enormous risk. She was in her early 30s, thin and pale with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, dressed in professional clothes that marked her as someone who worked in an office rather than on the land, and she clutched a manila envelope to her chest like it was both precious and dangerous. "My name is Rebecca Hart," the woman said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was close enough to hear. "I'm a clerk at the County Administration Office, Records and Finance Department. I've been there for 8 years, and I've been watching things, documenting things, waiting for someone brave enough to actually use what I found. When I heard about this meeting, heard that Sarah Thornton's daughter had come back and was standing up to Bridgewater, I knew it was time." She handed Emma the envelope with trembling hands, and Martha moved closer, creating a protective circle around them, as Emma opened it and pulled out a thick stack of photocopied documents, financial records that made her blood run cold as she began to understand their significance. The first section contained bank records and cancelled checks showing regular monthly payments from Bridgewater Agricultural Corporation to Sheriff Wade Brennan, amounts ranging from $5,000 to $10,000, disguised on the books as consulting fees for agricultural security services, a fiction that fell apart when Rebecca's careful notes pointed out that Brennan had no expertise in agriculture, and that the payments had been going on for 12 years, totaling well over $500,000. The pattern was clear and damning. Brennan was not a law enforcement officer serving the public, but a paid enforcer, protecting Bridgewater's interests, and Rebecca had documented specific dates when payments increased, correlating them with incidents where people who complained about water quality or health issues had suddenly faced harassment from the sheriff's department, been cited for spurious violations, or had their concerns dismissed without investigation. But it was the second section of documents that made Emma feel physically sick, because Rebecca had somehow obtained records from St. Agnes Orphanage's financial statements, and there, buried in the donations column for the year Emma was born, was a massive payment from Bridgewater Agricultural Corporation. $200,000 given as an unrestricted gift to support the care of foundling children, made just weeks after Emma had been left on the orphanage steps. Rebecca's notes explained what this meant in simple, devastating terms. Bridgewater had paid the orphanage to ensure that no questions were asked about the baby girl who had mysteriously appeared, to make sure no investigation was conducted into her origins, to guarantee that if anyone ever came looking for Sarah Thornton's child, the trail would be cold, and the records would be deliberately vague and incomplete. Mrs. Hartwell, the director who had handed Emma that rusted key with such dismissive indifference, had known all along, had been paid to keep Emma's identity hidden, had been complicit in the cover-up that allowed Bridgewater to get away with murder. Rebecca looked at Emma with eyes that held both compassion and fierce determination. "The corruption goes all the way through this county," she said. "Bridgewater owns the sheriff. They own officials in the county government. They've bought silence from institutions that should have protected you. But I've been copying documents for 3 years, building a case, waiting for the right moment. And this is it. Use these records. Give them to the FBI. Burn Bridgewater to the ground." The federal response came with a speed and overwhelming force that Thomas Whitmore explained was only possible when the evidence was so comprehensive and the crimes so egregious that even bureaucratic caution gave way to moral outrage, and it happened on a cold, clear morning, exactly 1 week after the church meeting, when a convoy of unmarked SUVs and FBI tactical vehicles descended on Bridgewater Agricultural Corporation's regional facility on the outskirts of Derby, while simultaneously, 300 miles away in Helena, federal agents were breaching the doors of the corporate headquarters. Emma watched from Martha's truck parked on a distant hill, Scout pressed against her side, as more than 30 federal agents in tactical gear executed search warrants with military precision, flooding into the facility's offices and warehouse, while employees were ordered out with their hands visible, their shocked faces showing they had never imagined their powerful employer could be touched by the law. Through binoculars, Emma saw Derek Carlyle being led out in handcuffs, his expensive suit jacket pulled over his cuffed wrists, his face no longer smooth and confident, but pale with the dawning realization that his world was ending. And she felt a fierce satisfaction watching the man who had threatened her life being put into the back of a federal vehicle. Sheriff Wade Brennan's arrest happened an hour later at the county courthouse, and this time Emma was there in person with Martha and dozens of other Valley residents who had gathered to witness justice, watching as FBI agents walked into Brennan's office with a warrant for his arrest on charges of corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder. Rebecca Hart standing among the crowd with tears of vindication streaming down her face as the sheriff who had intimidated and silenced so many people was led out in handcuffs, his florid face twisted with impotent rage. The scale of the operation became clear as the day progressed, and news reports began broadcasting images from Helena, where Bridgewater's corporate headquarters had been completely locked down, the company's CEO and 7 senior executives taken into custody, their computers seized, their files boxed up and loaded into federal vehicles, and Thomas Whitmore called Emma personally to tell her that the EPA had found evidence of similar illegal dumping operations in 3 other states, that Bridgewater's environmental crimes spanned decades and multiple jurisdictions, and that Sarah's evidence had opened a door that was revealing a pattern of corporate malfeasance far beyond what anyone had imagined. That evening, Agent Chen from the FBI came to Martha's house, where Emma was staying, and sat at the kitchen table with coffee and profound respect in her eyes, explaining that they had already found internal Bridgewater emails discussing the Thornton problem and making veiled references to permanent solutions, communications that strongly suggested the corporation had ordered Sarah's murder, even if they had been careful not to explicitly state it in writing. Chen told Emma that one of the arrested executives, a man named Vernon Mills, who had handled security operations, was already cooperating in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his testimony was providing details about what had happened the night Sarah disappeared, confirmation that she had been murdered and her body disposed of, though they had not yet recovered her remains. Emma listened with tears streaming down her face, finally hearing official acknowledgement that her mother had been killed for trying to protect people, that Sarah Thornton had been a hero who paid the ultimate price for her courage, and Agent Chen reached across the table to take Emma's hand, saying words that Emma would remember for the rest of her life. "Your mother started this fight, and you finished it. Because of you, Bridgewater Agricultural Corporation will cease to exist. Dozens of criminals will go to prison, and this valley will finally get the cleanup and justice it deserves." Vernon Mills broke completely under the weight of federal charges that would put him in prison until he died, and 3 days after his arrest, he requested a meeting with Agent Chen and offered full cooperation in exchange for a plea deal, and Emma was asked if she wanted to be present when he gave his testimony, a question that seemed impossible to answer because part of her desperately needed to know the truth, while another part wanted to preserve the small hope that somehow her mother had survived and was living somewhere under a different name. She agreed to listen, and she sat in a small FBI office in Missoula, with Thomas Whitmore holding her hand and Scout lying across her feet, while Vernon Mills, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and the broken demeanor of someone whose conscience had finally overwhelmed his self-preservation, told them what had happened 18 years ago on the night Emma was born. Mills explained that he had been Bridgewater's head of security, and that Derek Carlisle, who was only a mid-level manager at the time, but ambitious and ruthless, had discovered that Sarah Thornton was planning to go public with her evidence and had ordered Mills to handle the situation permanently. Mills had taken 2 men to the Thornton farm on the night of October 28th, intending to search for the evidence and intimidate Sarah into silence. But when they arrived, they found her in labor, a midwife helping her deliver the baby in the farmhouse, and Carlisle had called Mills in a rage, screaming that they couldn't let her survive now, that she would go to the authorities the moment she recovered. Mills's voice shook as he described what happened next, how he had waited until the midwife left, how he had forced his way into the house while Sarah was holding her newborn daughter, how Sarah had fought him with desperate strength, begging him to spare her baby, and how she had managed to hide Emma in the barn in those final moments, before Mills shot her in the back as she tried to run for her truck. Mills had panicked, realizing he had committed murder, and he had called Carlisle, who arranged for Sarah's body to be taken to a remote section of Bridgewater's property, a fallow field that the company used for equipment, storage, and buried there in an unmarked grave that had remained undisturbed for 18 years, while Emma grew up alone in an orphanage, never knowing her mother had died trying to save her life. The FBI conducted a search of the location Mills described, bringing cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar to a desolate corner of Bridgewater property. And Emma stood at the police perimeter with Martha's arm around her shoulders as she watched federal agents carefully excavate the site. It took them 6 hours of painstaking work, but they found her. Sarah Thornton's remains, exactly where Mills said they would be, her bones wrapped in a tarp and buried 4 feet deep in Montana soil that had held her secret for nearly 2 decades. Emma collapsed to her knees when Agent Chen came to tell her they had confirmed the identification through dental records, and Scout pressed his body against her as she sobbed, mourning the mother she never knew, and celebrating the fact that Sarah could finally be laid to rest with dignity, that the world would finally know the truth about her courage and her sacrifice, and that Emma could finally stop wondering and start healing. The federal trial began in late spring in the United States District Court in Helena, a proceeding that had drawn national media attention and filled the courtroom gallery with Valley residents who had suffered from Bridgewater's crimes, and Emma sat in the witness box on a bright May morning, wearing a simple dress Martha had helped her choose, holding her mother's leather-bound journal in her hands, like a sacred text, as the federal prosecutor, a sharp woman named Patricia Moreno, guided her through testimony that would be replayed on news broadcasts across the country. Emma spoke clearly and deliberately, telling the jury of 12 ordinary citizens about growing up in St. Agnes Orphanage without knowing her name or her history, about receiving a rusted key on her 18th birthday, about finding the tractor and the evidence her mother had hidden with such desperate foresight, and about reading Sarah's journal and understanding that her mother had not abandoned her, but had died trying to protect her. She read passages from the journal aloud, Sarah's words describing the contamination she had discovered, the harassment she had endured, her fear for her unborn child, and her determination that the truth would survive even if she did not. And there was not a dry eye in the courtroom as Emma's voice broke while reading her mother's final incomplete sentence, the words that ended mid-thought as violence came through the door. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically over 3 weeks, building a case so comprehensive and damning that Bridgewater's expensive defense attorneys could do nothing but try to minimize sentences, the soil samples and laboratory reports showing catastrophic contamination, the internal memos discussing illegal dumping with cold corporate calculation, the photographs of Bridgewater trucks and uniformed employees at dump sites, the financial records showing payments to Sheriff Brennan, the video footage of the arson at Emma's barn, and finally, Vernon Mills's testimony describing Sarah Thornton's murder in detail that made several jurors visibly ill. Thomas Whitmore testified as an expert witness, explaining how the contamination had spread through the groundwater system to poison wells across the valley, presenting maps and scientific analysis that connected Bridgewater's criminal activity to the cluster of cancers, birth defects, and chronic illnesses that had plagued valley families for years, and his testimony gave scientific validation to the suffering that residents had endured without understanding its source. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for all defendants, and when Judge Catherine Morrison handed down sentences 2 weeks later, her words were harsh and uncompromising. Derek Carlisle received 40 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit murder, environmental crimes, and racketeering. Vernon Mills received 25 years despite his cooperation. Sheriff Brennan received 15 years for corruption and obstruction of justice, and Bridgewater's CEO and senior executives received sentences ranging from 20 to 35 years for their roles in orchestrating and covering up environmental crimes that had spanned decades. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Judge Morrison addressed the bankruptcy proceedings that had been filed simultaneously, ruling that Bridgewater Agricultural Corporation would be dissolved entirely, its assets seized by the federal government, and placed into a supervised trust fund dedicated exclusively to funding the massive environmental cleanup operation that would take years to complete, and to providing compensation for the families whose health and lives had been destroyed by corporate greed disguised as agricultural business, ensuring that every dollar the corporation had earned through crime would be returned to the valley it had poisoned. The cleanup operation began in early summer with a scope and commitment that would have been unimaginable a year ago, when Bridgewater had seemed untouchable and the valley's suffering had been an invisible epidemic that no one acknowledged. But now the Federal Environmental Protection Agency and Montana Department of Environmental Quality descended on the Bitterroot Valley with teams of scientists, engineers, and heavy equipment to begin the enormous task of remediating decades of contamination. Emma stood with Martha and Thomas Whitmore at one of the first cleanup sites, watching as workers in protective suits collected soil samples, installed monitoring wells, and began the painstaking process of excavating contaminated earth that would be transported to specialized treatment facilities. And Whitmore explained that this remediation would take years, perhaps a decade, involving the removal of thousands of tons of poisoned soil, the treatment of contaminated groundwater through pump and treat systems, and the restoration of wetlands that had been turned into toxic waste dumps. The EPA had established a community liaison office in Derby, staffed by people who held monthly meetings where Valley residents could ask questions, voice concerns, and receive updates on the cleanup progress. And for the first time in nearly 20 years, families felt heard and respected, rather than dismissed and intimidated. The Victims' Compensation Fund, established through the bankruptcy proceedings and funded by Bridgewater's seized assets, began distributing payments to families who could document health problems linked to the contamination. And while no amount of money could restore health or bring back the dead, it provided resources for medical treatment, for relocation if families chose to leave, and for rebuilding lives that had been shattered by corporate crime. Emma received a substantial compensations payment as Sarah Thornton's heir, and as a direct victim of Bridgewater's conspiracy. Money that represented both justice and opportunity, and she spent sleepless nights deciding how to use it before reaching a conclusion that felt right, that felt like honoring her mother's memory in a way that would create something lasting and meaningful. She hired contractors to rebuild the farmhouse, not as a restoration of the past, but as a transformation into something new, expanding it into a larger structure with modern amenities, while preserving the stone fireplace where she had first read her mother's journal. And she rebuilt the barn that had been destroyed by arson, making it larger and sturdier, designed not for equipment storage, but as a community gathering space with large windows that filled it with light. Martha worked alongside her every day, the old woman's knowledge of construction and farming invaluable, and Scout supervised everything with the proprietary air of someone who understood this was his home being rebuilt, his territory being reclaimed. Emma planted an organic garden where the old barn had stood, working the soil with her own hands, and she chose native plants that would attract pollinators and birds, creating a space of life and growth where fire and destruction had once reigned. She installed a memorial stone near the garden's center, a simple granite marker engraved with Sarah's name and dates and a single line from her journal. The truth is in the soil. Words that had led Emma on this journey and would now remind every visitor of the courage it took to speak truth to power. And as summer progressed and the garden began to flourish, as the buildings took shape and the valley slowly healed, Emma felt something she had never experienced in her 18 years of life. She felt like she was home, like she belonged somewhere, and like her mother's sacrifice had finally been given the meaning and recognition it deserved. The official opening of the Sarah Thornton Environmental Education Center happened on a brilliant October morning, exactly 1 year after Emma had received the rusted key that changed her life, and more than 300 people gathered on the transformed property to celebrate not just the opening of a building, but the redemption of a story that had been buried in silence and fear for too long. Emma stood on the new porch of the expanded farmhouse, looking out at the crowd of Valley residents, EPA officials, journalists, and environmental advocates who had come to witness this moment. And she felt her mother's presence so strongly, it was almost physical, as if Sarah was finally able to see that her sacrifice had not been in vain. The farmhouse had been transformed into a museum dedicated to telling Sarah's story, through carefully curated exhibits that displayed her journals behind protective glass, explained her scientific work in accessible language, showed photographs of the contamination sites before and after cleanup, and honored the courage it took to stand against corporate power when doing so meant risking everything. Martha had helped design the layout, insisting that the exhibits not just document past crimes, but inspire future action. And the center included an entire wing dedicated to environmental science education, with laboratory equipment donated by Montana universities, a library of environmental texts, and a teaching space where local students could learn about soil science, water quality testing, and the importance of environmental protection. The organic garden that Martha and Emma had planted together had flourished into a demonstration space showing sustainable farming practices, native plant restoration, and the healing power of working with rather than against the natural world, and volunteers from the community maintained it, finding therapy in the act of growing food in soil that had been reclaimed from poison. Scout had become the unofficial mascot of the center, his transformation from wild stray to beloved companion, a metaphor for the valley's own journey from trauma to healing, and he greeted every visitor with gentle dignity, allowing children to pet his graying fur, while he kept one eye always on Emma, his person, the daughter of the woman he had waited for through years of lonely vigil. The center offered free programs to valley families, providing soil and water testing services, hosting community meetings about ongoing cleanup efforts, and creating a permanent memorial to the victims of Bridgewater's crimes, with a wall of photographs showing the faces of those who had died from contamination-related illnesses, ensuring their suffering would be remembered and their stories would prevent future corporate malfeasance. Emma had found her purpose in this work, enrolling in online environmental science courses while managing the center, planning to follow in her mother's footsteps not just by completing Sarah's interrupted work, but by building on it, by ensuring that the next generation would be equipped with knowledge and courage to protect the land they depended on. And as she cut the ribbon officially opening the Sarah Thornton Environmental Education Center, with Martha beside her and Scout at her feet, and the mountains rising behind them in their eternal watch, Emma understood that she had transformed a place of secrets and sorrow into something her mother would have been proud of, a beacon of truth, a center of learning, and a testament to the power of one person's courage to change the world. Emma sat on the rebuilt porch of the Sarah Thornton Environmental Education Center on a cold November morning, exactly 1 year to the day since Mrs. Hartwell had handed her a rusted key and changed the trajectory of her entire existence. And she held in her lap a letter she had written the night before, words she needed to speak aloud, even though the person they were addressed to could only hear them in whatever place souls go when their earthly stories end. Scout lay at her feet, his graying muzzle resting on her boots, and Martha sat beside her in comfortable silence, understanding that this moment belonged to a daughter and her mother, to a conversation that had been waiting 18 years to happen. Emma unfolded the letter with trembling hands, and she began to read, her voice carrying across the property where her mother had lived and worked, and made the impossible choice that had saved Emma's life. "Dear Mom," Emma began, the word feeling both foreign and perfectly natural on her tongue. "I never got to call you that when you were alive, never got to know your voice or feel your arms around me. But I know you now in ways that matter more than memory. I know your courage, your brilliance, your fierce protective love that was strong enough to sacrifice everything, including the chance to watch me grow up. I found the key you left for me, though it took 18 years to reach my hands. And I found the tractor where you hid your truth. And I found your journal where you poured out your heart and your fear and your determination that justice would survive, even if you could not. I need you to know that it worked, that your plan succeeded beyond what you could have imagined. The evidence you preserved with such desperate foresight brought down the corporation that killed you, sent dozens of criminals to prison, and started a healing process that will restore this valley you loved. The contamination sites are being cleaned, the poisoned wells are being treated, and families who suffered in silence for years finally have answers and hope. I testified in federal court holding your journal, telling a jury about your sacrifice. And when the verdicts came down, guilty on every count, I felt you there with me, felt your spirit finally able to rest, knowing that the truth you died for had been heard. But more than that, I want to thank you for the gift you gave me that I'm only now beginning to understand. You gave me purpose, you gave me identity, and you gave me a story that matters. I am no longer just Emma, the orphan girl with no history and no name. I am Emma Rose Thornton, your daughter, and I carry your legacy, not as a burden, but as a badge of honor. I've transformed this farm into something that honors your memory and continues your work, teaching others about environmental protection, providing resources for community healing, and ensuring that corporate greed will never again poison this valley in silence. I've enrolled in environmental science courses, following the path you blazed, and I plan to become the scientist you were, the protector of land and water and truth that this world desperately needs. The key to an old tractor unlocked not just a machine, or even just evidence, but a truth powerful enough to heal an entire valley, and a daughter powerful enough to finish what her mother started. I wish you could see what I've built here, could see Scout, who I think was yours, and is now mine, his loyalty spanning the years you've been gone. Could see Martha, who saved my life the night you died, and has become the grandmother I never had. Could see the garden growing, where ashes once lay, and children learning about soil science in the barn we rebuilt from destruction. Could see Thomas Whitmore, who never stopped believing in you, and who helped me honor your work. But I think somehow you do see it. That you're here in the wind, through the pines, and the clarity of the mountain air, and the soil that finally tells truth instead of holding secrets. I've learned that family is not just blood, but the people who stand with you when standing is dangerous. That home is not where you were born, but where you choose to build something meaningful. And that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right, even when everything inside you screams to run and hide. You taught me all of that through your sacrifice, through the evidence you left behind, through the journal entries where I could see you wrestling with impossible choices and choosing love and justice every single time. I love you, Mom, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure the world remembers what you fought for, and what you gave up so that I could live, and so that this valley could heal. And I promise you that your sacrifice was not in vain, that your daughter understands now why you had to let her go, and that she will carry your name and your mission forward with the same courage you showed on that final terrible night when you chose justice over safety and my life over your own. Emma's voice broke as she finished reading, tears streaming down her face, and she folded the letter carefully and placed it in a weatherproof box she had prepared, walking with Scout and Martha to the memorial garden where Sarah's ashes had been scattered after the FBI had released her remains, and she buried the letter there beneath a young pine tree she had planted, a living monument that would grow stronger with each passing year, just as Emma herself had grown from a frightened orphan into a woman with purpose, belonging, and a legacy worth defending.